Mhm.
But here's a really, really good question from Daya. Hi, Noah and Carlos. I have a question. Forgive me if it's not phrased best, and if it's off topic, feel free to ignore it. In a couple past streams, debate ones, I think. I've watched Noah talk about how I've watched Noah has talked about definitions and how Hegel warned against the use of them. Why should we steer away from trying to focus on definitions? And are there any resources that explain this a little more or more simply than Hegel does? You mind if I take a stab at this one real quick?
Yeah, I want to just clear up real quick. It's Engels that I'm
Yeah.
referencing rather than Hegel. But yeah, go ahead, brother.
Yeah, well, what you're doing when you provide a definition, especially for something that's supposed to describe the world, is that you're almost like sucking the vitality out of it because it exists, it lives, it is actual in a world in which it is in constant movement, in constant interconnection with everything else, and in a constant referential dialectical relationship with a developing totality. If it's a social phenomenon, it's a social totality. So when you take it out for the sake of a definition, the value of the scientific assessment of the phenomenon goes down and down and down and down and down. That's the essence of it. That doesn't mean that for practical purposes we can't have definitions. Like without having at least a very basic sense of definitions, we couldn't really live. So there's a role for definitions, right? There's different fields. When you're trying to analyze scientific thinking, a different logic applies to that. When you're trying to analyze different questions of knowledge, a more basic, perhaps traditional logic applies to that, and conjoined to that, a more basic understanding of definitions. But for the more complex analysis, the more scientific, the more comprehensive, when you're analyzing the concrete, so the more comprehensive, that understanding of definitions as these static entities really has to go. I mean, think about how Marx approaches the questions of commodity. He doesn't just sit there and tell you this is the definition of a commodity. Boom, that's it. Book is over. So many of the debates that have occurred in Marxist scholarship have been, well, Marx didn't give us a definition of class. Marx didn't give us a definition of this. Yeah, because you can't fucking accurately describe something scientifically if you're just giving a couple sentence definition for it. He unfolds it dialectically. He ascends to the concrete in a way that traces the logical development of that thing he is describing. It is up to you to read it and not to come out with a simple definition, but to understand it as a process, as an evolving process. So he gives us the germ of capitalist production, the commodity, and then he develops it and concretizes it over 3 volumes. Yes, for the sake of perhaps teaching militants, you can reduce it and have more definition like ways of approaching the thing, but the goal is to educate them to the point of understanding that that's only step 1, baby. You have to get to step 10. You have to concretize, because knowledge is itself a dialectical process of concretizing. So definitions might be good for the beginning, but your goal should be to work towards an understanding of the role that definitions play at one moment, but the role that they also play in sucking the thing that they're describing out of the vitality and the dynamism in which it exists in.
Yeah, I would only add that Engels says to just remember when you're forced to use definitions, never forget their limitations, right?
Right.
Um, Understand a thing in its process. Like Carlos said, the commodity is where the logic of capital begins for a reason, right? And the development of society through this is through all these specific points for a reason, right? When people say Marx never gave us a definition of this, Marx never gave us a definition of that, it's because they're not thinking dialectically. They're just not. And this is why we're always talking about we need American Marxism, right? Because that necessity of having a definition is part of the problem. Not that
Yeah.
I don't want to blame anyone for
Yeah.
this, by the way. Like, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, like, we need to um, be asking the exact questions that was it Dea just asked. That's the
Yeah.
perfect
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Rather than complaining that Marx didn't give us a definition, so we need to make up a definition. No, there's a reason. You don't think Marx Karl fucking Marx was like, whoa, I didn't give them a definition. They're gonna no, there's a reason for everything he did.
And Hegel doesn't come out explicitly and talk about definitions in this way, but he does it with other things that are homologous to what definitions are. If you look at, any of his texts on logic, whether it's the lectures on logic, whether it's the science of logic, whether it's the first part of the encyclopedia, every time he is addressing a concept, he tears it apart.
What about the lectures on the history of philosophy?
Not that one specifically. That one he's doing it with the history of philosophy. But in terms of the logical development of concepts into other concepts that are more refined, that solve whatever apparent contradiction was in the previous one, right? So this understanding of the fluidity of the description of various things and their the way in which you can't just fixate an understanding of a thing through a definition. That is apparent. That is implicit in the work of Hegel, the logical work, right? So if you're, there's people that go ahead and when they're just getting started, they'll read like the first part, and then they'll make this big generalizational or generalized abstraction about what Hegel says about this. And because they don't see it unfold into what it unfolds into, they don't describe that moment, that initial moment in the logical development of the concept. They don't describe it correctly. They don't fully understand it because they haven't seen what it unfolds into. Just like a cocoon, you don't understand it. Is it a cocoon? What's the pre-stage of a butterfly? It's a cocoon, right?
Yeah, it's a cocoon. By the way, speaking, I have to run into a cocoon for like 3 minutes. I'll be right back.
You don't understand a cocoon fully if you don't see what it is unfolding itself into. Now, this applies for Hegel. This applies for Marxism as well, right? You have in Capital, the 3-4 volumes of Capital, you have a conceptual development such that the concepts that appear later on, in order to understand those, you need the concepts that appear before that. It's a necessary logical sequence. You couldn't understand, for instance, the distinction between absolute and relative surplus value if you don't understand value, exchange value, use value, etc. So they concretize, they build themselves up so that as he starts volume 3 saying, now the thing that we're going to be describing looks more and more like the social totality that we have in front of us because it's the most comprehensive, the most concrete. But it goes the other way around as well, right? You don't fully understand the first few categories, the commodity, use, and exchange value, etc., if you don't understand what it develops into. So it works both ways. If the example I always bring up is like, you can't understand fully the first Godfather movie if you're not seeing it in its unfolding into the second and the third part, right? And clearly you can't understand the second and the third part if you haven't seen the first part. So it's dialectical, and that should always be kept in mind.